I pulled up outside the facility and was instantly confused as it looked dilapidated and couldn't be the right place. There was a gate barring the entrance, and I was about to turn and leave when I saw movement behind the gate. An old withered man moved out of the shadows and began to open the gate and then waved at me to enter. I drove past him and smiled at him and thanked him. His face was covered by a hood, and I couldn't get a good look at him. He disappeared back inside a shack that stood just inside the gate. I stepped out of my car and stared at a building that looked like it could fall down at any moment. A woman who looked like she was in his 60s came rushing out and told me I was told. I tried to explain that I had got lost but couldn't get a word in as she was talking a mile a minute. She led me inside and we began moving down a dark and dreary hallway. She introduced herself as Mrs. Evans and told me that I would be dealing with a class of special children, and I need to be careful around them. The normal teacher was away for a week, and I was filling in for them. She handed me a piece of paper and told me that these were the rules, and I should be fine as long as I followed them. She opened a door and then pushed me inside before slamming the door behind me. I stood there momentarily shocked for a moment, staring at the door. I heard a sneeze behind me and turned to find a dozen young children staring at me. I quickly composed myself and tucked the piece of paper into my pocket. I introduced myself to the children, and their interest in me quickly waned as they went back to what they were doing earlier. A girl with blue eyes and blonde eyes walked up and introduced herself as Emily. She asked if she could have the safety scissors as she needed it for her art project. I handed it over and smiled to myself at how polite she was. She smiled at me, and I was surprised to see that she had no teeth in her mouth. She moved back to her desk and began to cut dozens of thin strips of paper. Her blue eyes suddenly flared red for a moment, and she moved over to the boy closest to her. Before I had a chance to react, she plunged the scissors into the boy's throat. A torrent of blood sprayed out in every direction while Emily stood there cackling. The other children continued to work away even as the blood soaked them. The torrent of blood seemed never-ending, and soon there was blood dripping from the ceiling. My clothes were saturated in blood, and I wiped my face and was unnerved at how much blood came off. I ran from the room screaming for help and bumped into Mrs. Evans at the end of the hall. She chided me for leaving the children unsupervised and didn't even acknowledge me when I tried to explain what had happened. She practically dragged me back to the classroom, and I stood there frozen in shock while gazing at the classroom. The blood had now vanished, and the children were sitting in their seats, acting like nothing had happened. The boy whose throat had been cut was now perfectly fine. My clothes were now free of blood, and I could see the look of disapproval on Mrs. Evans' face. Mrs. Evans carefully took the scissors from Emily's desk, while Emily sat there with a toothless smile on her face. Her smile was unnerving, and I could tell that Mrs. Evans was scared of Emily for some reason. Mrs. Evans handed me the scissors and told me that I needed to follow the rules. The rest of the day was uneventful, but I caught the children giving me glances throughout the day. The only time I got any peace and quiet was when the children all lay down for their naps. I was beyond relieved when Mrs. Evans arrived and told me that I could leave. I arrived home and was taking the stuff out of my pockets when I found the list of rules. I read them repeatedly as they were the most confusing set of rules I ever read. They were as follows. Don't give Emily the safety scissors under any circumstances. Any of the children start floating during nap time, then don't get too close to them. Sing some of the lyrics from Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley until their bodies are once again on the floor. Never ever tell the children where you live or leave your purse where the children can get at it. Don't let the children hold hands and form a circle. Use a fire extinguisher on them if necessary to break them apart. Finally, and most importantly, if the children start removing their skin, then close your eyes and start praying out loud. Do not open your eyes or stop praying until the guttural screams stop. I was still reading when I felt a cold nose rub my legs. I reached over and began petting my dog, Larry. I had to lift him up onto the bed beside me as he was getting too old to hop up. Most of his teeth had fallen out and he was left with a few rotted teeth. The next day was very quiet as the children sat there playing and generally just ignored me. I had to leave to go to the bathroom and was gone for a few minutes. I noticed that my purse had moved slightly but wrote it off as just being my imagination. When I got home that night, I knew something was wrong as Larry didn't come to greet me at the door. I let out a shriek after finding his mangled corpse in the bathtub. Someone had pulled out his intestines and then wrapped his body in them. His jaw had been snapped in two, and his eyeballs had been shoved inside his open mouth. I froze when I heard a whimper coming from him and realized he was still alive. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and slit his throat to end his suffering. I wept myself to sleep as I had raised Larry since he was a puppy, and he was part of my family. I was still quite shook when I got to the classroom as I couldn't get the picture of Larry's tortured remains out of my mind. I sat in my chair and gazed across the room as the children played with their toys. I felt my blood run cold as Emily looked over at me and opened her mouth and smiled at me with a toothy grin. I stood there transfixed while gazing at the teeth that had been up until yesterday in my dog's mouth. She laughed and then ran to play with the others while I sat there feeling numb. I barely moved from my chair and didn't even realize that the children had laid down for nap time. I was snapped out of my trance as my body felt like it was being boiled alive. I stared up to see all of the children floating almost a meter off the ground with their blankets still covering their bodies. I stood up and began creeping towards them. The heat was getting warmer with every step I took towards them. The hairs on my arm began to sizzle as the heat reached unnatural levels. I began to back away as I was on the brink of passing out. I remembered what the note said and began to sing the lyrics to Never Gonna Give You Up. The bodies began to move downwards while I sang away. The heat instantly stopped the moment they were all once again on the ground. I stopped singing and just stood there speechless and wondering if I should just run away. I knew that I desperately needed the money, so I couldn't just leave without getting paid. My arms looked like they had been out in the sun for hours, and I had a nice even tan on them the next morning. Mrs. Evans cornered me in the hallway the next morning and asked if I had been following the rules. A look of relief crept across her face when I explained that I had been doing what I was told. She patted me on the back and reminded me that this was my second last day. The children were milling around in the room when I entered, and I got a bad feeling that something bad was going to happen. My brain was telling me that there was something missing from the room, but I couldn't place what it was. I took my seat and closed my eyes and began picturing the room to try and figure out what was missing. I sat like this for 5 or so minutes until my eyes shot open and I spun around to stare into the corner. My heart rate skyrocketed as I stared at the place that the fire extinguisher had hung just yesterday. Time seemed to slow down as I turned my head to gaze at the children who were now sitting in a circle with their arms linked. They were chanting a language that I couldn't understand, and the air around them seemed to be shimmering. A small hole appeared in the air above them, and a clawed hand tried to force its way through. It stopped after a few failed attempts as the hole was too small. I rushed forward to try and stop the children by dragging them away. My attempts were futile as their bodies felt like stone and were impossible to move. The hole was increasing in size with every passing second, and I could see hundreds of eyes watching me from the other side. Their gaze held such malice that I felt myself shrinking away from them. I rushed out the door and ran around until I found a nearby fire extinguisher. I quickly read the instructions before moving back inside the classroom. One of the creatures from the other side of the hole was in the process of climbing through. Its skin was charred black, and the only feature that I could make out on its body were the red eyes that locked onto mine. I aimed the nozzle of the fire extinguisher and began spraying away. It let out an ear-splitting scream and tried to retreat back inside the hole. The children's chanting ceased and the hole closed almost instantly. The creature hadn't managed to fully retreat, and a portion of his claw had been sliced off. Emily picked it up and devoured it without a second thought. The children went back to playing while I stood there clutching the fire extinguisher. I arrived early the next day as I knew that I would be free of this place in a couple of hours. I walked inside the classroom and was happy to see the fire extinguisher was still there. The children were all smiling up at me as if someone had just told them a joke. The day started off smoothly and I sat back and kept a close eye on them. Their bodies once again began to float at nap time, but I started singing before their bodies had barely left the ground. The children stood up from their naps, and their grins had once again returned. Emily reached into her mouth and began tearing the skin off her flesh using just her hands. The other children began following her lead, and they quickly had ripped all their flesh off. You could see every muscle in their body, and their grins had taken on a more demonic tone. They began to advance on me, and I closed my eyes and began praying out loud. Tiny sets of hands began roaming my body, and I tried my best to keep myself from vomiting. I opened my eyes slightly and watched as another hole appeared in the middle of the room. Screams of agony began emanating from within, and I could see figures inside that looked like they were being tortured. I don't know how long I kept my eyes shut, but it felt like an eternity. I only opened them when I felt a hand rest on my shoulder. Mrs. Evans stood over me and thanked me for my help this week. I grabbed my belongings and took one last look at the children who were now back to normal. I followed Mrs. Evans out the door and felt waves of relief wash over me, knowing that I would never have to come back. I received my salary for the week and practically sprinted out the door. I never taught children after this day and ended up working in a prison as it seemed safer. I cannot help but hope that the person who next helped with those children followed the rules. I don't want to imagine what those children could unleash on the world if they are left unsupervised.